Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Peer. And this is our second calendar year, kicking it off in January with three Kansas City artists. My name is Patrick Alexander, and I'm with the Charlotte Street Foundation. We're based here in Kansas City, Missouri. And this is going to be a quick little presentation of three local regional artists in the Kansas City area. And we do this every month, and as a way to kind of connect emerging artists, mid-career and established, in ways that they can connect, hopefully skill sharing or just broadening their own network of, patrons and things like that. So with that, we've been doing this during the COVID period, just to kind of see what's going on in people's studios, and we haven't been able to get out to all the exhibitions and all that stuff that we love. So I'm going to save some time because it's really about each one of these artists will go and give a 5-minute slide presentation that they've created ahead of time. They will either be narrating or it's recorded. So just sit back and you'll watch those three, and then we'll have a little Q&A with the three artists as well, that they can ask questions. If you have a burning question, you can put that in the chat as well. Again, so tonight we have Kim Eichler-Messmer, we have Rebecca Vaughan, and we have Rachel Ferber. Rachel Ferber. Sorry, I'm looking up the names too fast. Okay, and then my colleague Hope will be managing and running all of these. So that's what the Charlotte Street Foundation window is. So Hope, if you don't mind, let's kick it off with Kim.
Hi everybody, my name is Kim Eichler-Messmer. I create quilts and collaged textiles constructed primarily of natural materials such as wool, silk, cotton, and linen. I use both thrifted and new fabrics that I hand dye using natural dyes made from plants and insects. I have always felt connected to nature. As a kid, I spent as much time outside as I could and was equally interested in science and art. I spent 2 years studying engineering in college before deciding to pursue a BFA and later an MFA, but the scientific method of asking questions and setting up experiments to discover the answers has stuck with me. My relationship with nature has continued and plays a crucial role in my studio practice. Gardening, foraging, nearly daily walks, and vacations spent hiking and exploring nature allow me the time and space to observe, reflect, gather, collect, steward, and feel simultaneously small and expansive. The mindfulness that nature provides is a reminder to always stay open to seeing and experiencing the world around me. I try to notice what I notice and collect it all through photographs. Shadow, pattern, color, form, texture, and light are recurring elements in my photo stream. I generally have two approaches when making my work. The first, as depicted in the photo on the left, begins with a dye question that I set out to answer by creating a wide range of variables and exploring possible outcomes. My other approach, represented by the quilt on the right, is to use fabric left over from the dye testing and from my collection to construct pieced compositions that play with structure and form in a much more improvisational way. In an attempt to be mindful of where my materials come from and how I utilize them, I grow or forage many of my own dyes, such as black walnuts, Osage orange, madder, marigolds, and weld. Here are some shots of my garden last summer. By investing the time in growing the dyes myself, I find that I am much more connected to the process and resulting fabric. The ability to have control over the outcome, while also being part of the entire process, is meaningful to me. A large part of my dye process also involves testing ingredients, recipes, and processes. Indigo is an amazing dye that has been used all over the world for thousands of years. An indigo vat can provide gorgeous blue dye for years if taken care of properly. There are many approaches to creating an indigo vat, and I have worked to understand 4 different types of vat through testing, observing, and record keeping. These photos are from summer 2019, when I began learning about fermentation vats, the oldest and most complex of the methods. I am also interested in the longevity of natural dyes. Not all plants will provide dye, and not all color derived from plants is color fast. So I regularly set up experiments to test the color fastness of various plants using different methods of extracting the dye and binding the dye to the fiber. There is a lot of confusing and inaccurate information about natural dyes, and many sources teach processes that result in ephemeral color. Though I fully understand and embrace that my work will not last forever, it's important to me that I use the best possible practices to ensure responsible longevity. I am also excited about the endless possibilities of using traditional textile techniques with natural dyes to create beautiful and unique fabrics. Here's an example of a dye method called shibori that involves compressing fabric to resist dye. In this case, I am folding fabric, sewing through the layers to create the compression, and then dyeing the fabric, repeating those steps for each of the 3 dye baths I used. For my constructed quilts, I cut and sew many small blocks, working quickly and responding to the fabric. Once I have a large number of blocks constructed, I begin laying them out on my wall to create a composition that I like, rotating, rearranging, and sewing new blocks as needed. Many traditional quilts are made up of individual patches or blocks sewn together to create a greater whole. I take advantage of that history and construction method to make larger pieces out of smaller components. Here is the finished version on the right. The quilt on the left is a larger and more complex version of the shibori process I showed before. This quilt is made of 9 squares of fabric, each folded, stitched, and dyed in at least 4 different dyes to build up the layers of color and pattern. Working within a framework like quilting that has limited variables allows me the freedom to work intuitively and joyfully. Thank you all so much for your time. If you're interested in learning more, please feel free to check out my website and Instagram account.
Thank you, Kim. Awesome. Next up, let's go with Rachel Ferber.
So my work involves video, sculpture, and textile processes, primarily garment construction and natural dyeing. But there are a lot of other processes that I use as part of the process of making other things. And so the images that you're seeing here are stills from a video series that I started while I was in grad school, and that I won't go into now, but I think this gives you a quick sort of taste of how I engage with material. So alongside this work in grad school, I also started an experimental natural dye project that was focused on the idea of a stain. And so we were using everyday waste materials and things that were often responsible for stains, like grass clippings and cooking oil, to intentionally sort of blemish garments as a way of challenging common perceptions of presentability, functionality, and expertise. So this project continues to inform my practice today. Oops. Next. So my work sort of broadly explores the commodification of our everyday lives, which happens through marketing as well as our performance of private space via our social media channels and the screen. So I'm interested in the way that design and media affect us psychologically, and also the way that they inform our understanding of material and our relation to the physical world. So this image documents a recent installation called Mostly Organic Projectiles. And then the next slide will play a clip from the video that you see on the screen, which is called Jokes on Every Wrapper. So a large part of my video practice involves these sort of private performances of my own. And so I'm creating costumes out of used domestic textiles like bed sheets and dish towels, which is something that I've actually been doing since 2015. So I think of these garments as both props and as sculptural stand-ins for the body. So this is another example of a prop that was made for use in a video. It's a sort of severed, distorted version of a couch. But then it was given a second life as a sculptural piece that functions on its own. So the image on the right is actually a detail showing the wall behind the sculpture, where you see this sort of oatmeal cookie dough material. And this is a reference to the video that this prop was used in. So this confusion of the reality of the materials and the images that you see on the screen is something that I play with a lot. And this was also installed alongside that video work. So I have this sort of ongoing archive of props and materials that I reuse and recycle in different works. So part of this piece, Smeared, was actually made in 2018, but here it's dealing with the complications of living life publicly. And if we are engaging in social media, we are then sort of living in the public eye on some level. So the smear is sort of a reference to the potential impacts on one's reputation, but at the same time, it brings us back to the private space of the body and the sort of inevitable messiness of being human. So these are some selects from Pillow series, which explores the form of the decorative or throw pillow as a means of critiquing excess and notions of value and necessity. So these are all made using found textiles, again, bed sheets and things of that nature, as well as textiles that I've dyed. Both the purple and the green are dyed with mulberries that I reclaimed from the sidewalk, as well as things that are kind of coming into play just from things around my studio. So some of them have also been used as props. I think of them as body doubles or sort of imitations of the real thing. And they were inspired in part by this scene that I captured at a local Goodwill store. And then this is a recent piece called Big Face Mask Green Smoothie Variety. And it's about as tall as I am. So in person, it has this presence that kind of, it makes me think of like a bearskin rug. It's a sort of like ominous object, despite the fact that it's made primarily of spinach, kale, and organic chia seeds. So this is really about looking critically at ourselves and our habits of consumption and calling them out as potentially dangerous or as something that should make us uncomfortable. Here's a detail. So I'm a little over, but this is my last slide. So right now I'm kind of in research mode. I'm currently experimenting with making bioplastic as an alternative to acrylic medium, which is used as the base in the face mask. I'm also collecting potential green screen paint samples from as many paint suppliers as I can. And sometimes they have these like wonderfully uncanny names, like this one that relate to my practice. And then I'm always doing lots of image research. This is a screenshot from an old Martha Stewart Living episode. And I'm currently collecting images from NASA's archive of this sort of Velcro system that was used for managing objects, food, and tools in zero gravity, which I think is just kind of like fantastically simple and kind of a silly system for something like NASA, and it just kind of fascinates me. So there's a detail of that. And here's my contact info. Thank you all.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. Great job. And third artist is Rebecca Vaughan. She's based in St. Joe, but commutes back and forth to KC. And so take it away.
All right. So my name is Rebecca Vaughan, and I grew up in Denver, Colorado. My undergrad degree is from CU Boulder, and my graduate degree is from Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. A few years ago, I left my life as a chair of fine arts at the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design, and I did so to rededicate myself to my art practice. My degrees and my background are in sculpture, and most of my work has centered, oh, there it is, the image advanced. And most of my work is centered around 3D materials. And I have taught sculpture at the college level for 25 years. This piece on the left is from my previous life. It's a series in which I use ladders as stand-ins for the human figure. This one wired with about 100 marquee lights. And my piece on the right is a self-portrait. a work about being adopted and what it feels like to not belong to a family or community structure. This is a taxidermy bear blank and is wired with motion sensors and reacts to viewers upon entering. So her chest lights up with marquee lights when you come near her. Let's see. It's not a next one. Okay, so these past 2 years, I mentioned, with the shift in my job and location, I began working with Foundling Museum textile tokens. In 18th century London, when a person was forced to relinquish a child, they left them at the Foundling Hospital in London. When they completed the intake paperwork for the child at the time of relinquishment, they were asked to leave a textile token, which was a matching swatch of fabric. This textile token would then be placed in the hospital archives in hopes for the eventual day when the person who relinquished the child could reclaim the youth. If so, they were required to produce that matching piece of textile years later as the sole evidence of the connection between these two humans. So I was deeply struck by this because a fragile, easily lost piece of fabric would be the sole manner of identification. This, of course, was so personal to me because of my own search for my biological family, whom I have never met. So I began to recreate the textile tokens on maps and many other systems of locating and navigation and direction. Here are some works, which are pencil and gouache on found maps. And I chose maps because of the connotation they make to navigating, as if I were able to direct that lost family member to each other years later through the signage of their reproductions on these geographic locations. So furthering the work, I recreated the textile tokens on a series of stop signs for an outdoor exhibit this past summer in Colorado. I used sign painter's enamel on outdoor grade foamed PVC sheets, which created a very flat and graphic effect, which is totally different from the gouache medium that I had grown fond of when working on the maps. Now, when you teach sculpture for 25 years, you got to know your stuff. You really get to know your materials and you get proficient at them. But what happens when you start working with a material you know nothing about, and in a formal approach that is new to you and outside of your visual thinking patterns? You feel clumsy, you're embarrassed in your lack of knowledge, you make muddy colors and awkward shapes with no reference to accuracy. And yet, shifting gears like this has been so important for me to experience this learning curve, to return to the true wonder and love for play, and remember what it feels like also for my students to be frustrated and new to materials in their journey. So this past summer, I started to crank out new works on paper while I've been crazy nomadic, driving through Denver, Marfa, Texas, and New Orleans. So I began to move the foundling textiles on top of birds, whom I came to also see as messengers, just like a stop sign would send a message. For this bird, for example, carries the weight of a stop sign with its feather texture on the sign, meanwhile wearing the foundling textile on its body. And also to play with the image of birds coupled with other textiles as well, shown here with historic quilts, a nod to Kim. And I came to realize that my love of materials was always eschewed in my schooling. It was just a time in the early 90s when concept was favored over materials instruction. And I had to abandon for a moment some of that deeply ingrained propensity to create works previously from a pure conceptual backing and return to a love of materials. And finally, sometimes I look at this new work and I wonder, I don't know, is it more for children's books or illustrations or dark stories for children? Like, I totally just don't know yet. But I can tell you that I'm making work that has enlivened my interest again and has me re-engaged in my practice. So thanks so much for letting me share this journey with you guys.
Thank you. That was so great. All three of you
Yay.
just did a wonderful job. And I'd go see that exhibit with all three of you in it. I guess part of why I selected you, because I was fascinated about the process and how you guys are exploring the materials being used. And there's a plethora of materials to always go after. But I guess, how do you decide though which ones you really want to then invest in? Is it really, maybe I'll go with you, Rachel, as far as these materials that you're going and testing, and is there a point where you stop, you're just like, this isn't working, or do you make it work, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's many points where things don't work. And I think that is actually part of what I'm interested in. I mean, I really related to what you just said, Rebecca, about this sort of like return to materiality as
Yeah,
that's something that it's like that you really need, and that is really refreshing, because I felt like my schooling was also very conceptual, and I think I sort of still am in this very conceptual space, but I'm trying to balance that. And I think my practice is actually very much about like getting closer to a more like raw, sort of like new experience of material that I think you kind of spoke to in relation to your work as well. But yeah, so now I feel like I'm not answering your question, Pat, but
It's just to get the conversation kicked off. So
yeah,
from there, no, it's great. I would love for you all to, ask each other some questions. I'm sure you have 1,000 each. Rebecca, do you have any?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for that description of your process too, because like I love to see how three of us are all maybe a little bit different in the process. Like I know, Kim, you have fun and you explore and you experiment, and it's not like you're a robot, but your scientific process has informed that. And then I feel like, I feel kind of in my own process, I feel maybe between the two of you guys, where I'm still, gouache and ink are like this like foreign alien substance. And I'm both part researching it for how people have used it before, but then just totally going off any track. I'd love to hear what you think of that as well, Kim.
Well, I really love what Rachel said a minute ago about how it's maybe more interesting when things don't work. And I feel that at my core. I do so many dye tests where I feel like I learn a ton of information, but it's what not to do, or, like a color that I don't like, or a process that won't work in quilts. So I feel like maybe 90% of what I do never ends up turning into work. This is going a little bit off topic, but something that I saw in both of your work and your presentations, Rachel and Rebecca, is that I think you use humor as like a sort of disarming mechanism to talk about much more serious topics. And I think, Rachel, you kind of talked about using silliness or humor to confront things about consumption. And I was wondering if you two could talk about maybe how you use humor, or how humor is effective in your work.
Yeah, I love that. the way you phrased that as sort of disarming, as that humor can as a sort, because that is exactly how I think about it. I think I think on like a personal level, that's like how I deal with things that are difficult, is I like kind of make fun of them. But I think it's also very cultural. I think it makes things go down easily or more easily. So yeah, that's a big part of my approach. I also think on some level, and this is like, I don't know how important it is to know this, but I have a background in like graphic design and marketing. And that I think has really influenced my work. And I always think of humor as sort of a marketing strategy too. So it's like this thing that I sometimes feel kind of like icky about using. Because it's so often used to sort of manipulate, and that's also the thing that I'm critical of. But I guess I'm always kind of, I feel like that's like this line that I'm interested in walking too, is like kind of in some ways like doing the thing that I'm critical of, or like being a part of this thing, but trying to use that to subvert or to like bring sort of the absurdities of these spaces to life, or of the way that they not really to life, I guess, but to light, to make these things more visible. Yeah.
Yeah, and I always thought humor was kind of like one of those awesome tricks that we have as artists in our back pocket to like lure and entice our viewers. If you can make something that had like a clever or something like so awkward or maybe surprise that it would draw someone over from across the room, and maybe humor is a great way to do that. Yeah, and also I want to also say too, Kim, I love mistakes. Like I think someday I want to publish a book of disastrous mistakes by artists and film directors and stuff like that. Like, don't tell me about your successes. I want to hear about what went wrong. And how did you get yourself out of it? Like, come on, don't you want to know that?
Yeah, totally. That's such a big part of most artists' practices, but it's something we don't usually talk about because it's like embarrassing, or it's not glamorous. It doesn't win the awards.
Totally.
I actually would like, if I told you all how many things I've made that were actually like mistakes. I mean, but I also feel like that, yeah, it is. It's like people just don't talk about it, like, but I also I think it's just like the way that you move on and like grow too, right? Like you have to mess something up to figure it out usually, or at least I do. And yeah, I mean, I would love to see this show. I also feel like it like the reality is that it also might be like a made up of work that we don't realize is was a mistake.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, I think that's another part of doing these is, because everyone is so isolated working in their studios, and you don't have that convo, especially if you're not in school anymore and things like that, and have that trusted person who gets it, and not have to explain the whole thing. So that's why I love pairing you all together, because I know you all each other get it like in that way. We're running out of time. It's always fast. I want to make sure, does anyone have any other comment or question? Got a couple more minutes.
I am going to break the fourth wall as Charlotte Street here. I do have a question for you guys, because I'm just so excited by the presentations that you guys had. And yeah, a similarity that I've seen between all of you is a really a purposeful practice of collecting, or having a sort of library, or building a library of tests and scraps and sort of a material language. And I just wanted to know a little bit more about how how you maintain that in your practice? Kim, you have the sort of library of different dyed material, and Rebecca, the foundling textiles. Like that's a sort of a library that you've collected. And so I just wanted to hear. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
I think for me, collecting is kind of a coping mechanism for just life. I feel like time goes so fast and there's so much information that I don't want to lose or forget about. And so collecting through photographs or through physical objects that I collect, on walks, or through like my diet notebooks, that's a way of trying to slow down and really like be present and understand something, and also try to hold on to it for the future so it doesn't just fly out of my head, because things do that if I don't have some sort of physical reminder of them.
Yeah, and I always thought collecting was it's always so different for different artists. Some artists have to go out and collect things that they don't know what they want to do with yet, and then they have this room full of stuff, and then suddenly one day it's like, oh, I know what to do with that thing now. But then some artists, and I would consider myself more like this, that I would go out and collect things that were already kind of percolating inside my head. Although who doesn't love to collect cool, beautiful things and keep them around? But that was sort of my philosophy about how I came into assembling and archiving so many things. What about you, Rachel?
Yeah, I think I just like naturally, yeah, I mean, I think I'm fascinated by the amount of material that like comes into my life that I don't have, that I would rather not come into my life, if that makes sense. So like, so like a lot of this, actually, I do a lot of cooking. And so I'm like always just like frustrated by the amount of like material and packaging that are a part of like buying vegetables, and like, but then I'm also like trying to find ways to make use of those things, and so part of it is research. Also part of it is like, I'm really fascinated by like the language of like the branding of something like a broccoli, even, right? Like in the way that we talk about these things. So part of it is like, it's just things that are just I'm coming into contact with, and I'm like kind of fascinated by, and then and that's how a lot of these things actually then come into like my work in some way, sometimes sculpturally, sometimes as a prop. But yeah, I mean, I think I think this like process of collecting is just a way for me to also like process and like make sense of things. And I always feel like I'm a pretty slow thinker. Like it takes me a long time to kind of like understand what I'm thinking and what all of these things mean. And so I like need to have them around. So I think I collect in order to think also.
Love it. Thank you all so much. This is great. We run out of time always in this, and we could talk all night. But I want you all to continue your conversation. So I do encourage you to connect. And audience, thank you for taking the time and listening. I encourage you to check out their websites. This will be posted again. And if you're into collecting, all three of them have great works. So they're all accessible. So thank you three so much. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing your work out in their galleries and whatnot. So
Thank you.
all right.
Thank you. This was such a great group.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to end it for this month, and we'll see you all in 4 weeks. Have a good night. Thank you.
Bye.